My name is Claire, and the night my father disowned me at our family's Thanksgiving table will forever burn in my memory like a scar carved across my heart. I had spent 8 long years quietly funneling nearly $9,600 every year into the household that raised me, covering bills, car payments, even the mortgage, believing that sacrifice might finally earn me a place of love and belonging. Instead, in front of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, my father pushed back his chair, his face red with disdain, and spat the words, "You're not family if all you think you give us is money." The room went silent. Forks froze halfway to lips. My younger brother beamed at him as though my humiliation were his triumph. I sat at the far end of the table, staring at the roasted turkey I had bought and cooked the wine I had chosen so carefully, the pies cooling on the counter, all dismissed in one sentence. What shocked me most wasn't the words themselves, but how easily they rolled off his tongue, as if he had been rehearsing them for years. I wish I could tell you that I shouted back, that I defended myself with all the fury of the sacrifices I had made. But in that moment, I felt the peculiar stillness that comes when your worst fear finally arrives. A strange calm, the kind that whispers, "This is the truth. Believe it now." Thanksgiving had always been the holiday I clung to, the hardest, the one time I hoped for some recognition. I'd spent hundreds of dollars preparing that feast. I had bought the organic turkey, the cranberry sauce that cost double the store brand, and the expensive bottles of wine I could barely afford, because I wanted desperately for them to see me. I told myself this year would be different. This year, they would finally acknowledge what I gave. Instead, my father carved me out of the family with a single slash of his voice. I glanced around the table. My mother stared down at her plate, her lips pressed thin, as if she agreed, but couldn't quite say it aloud. My brother smirked, basking in the unearned warmth that had always been reserved for him. My relatives shifted uncomfortably, whispering into their napkins, unwilling to intervene. I realized then that I had been living in an illusion. I thought money could bridge the gap of favoritism, that if I paid enough, did enough, gave enough, eventually they would love me equally. But sitting there in the house I had been quietly funding for nearly a decade, I understood to them I was not a daughter. I was a convenience, a wallet with legs. And so I did the only thing left to do. I placed my napkin gently beside my plate, stood up, and let the calm in my voice do what rage never could. "Then let him pay the $9,600, I said, nodding toward my brother. His smirk faltered. My father's face flushed deeper, but he said nothing. I picked up my purse and walked out, each step heavier than the last, but strangely freeing. The November air bit at my cheeks as I crossed the driveway to the car I had finally allowed myself to buy after 8 years of driving a rusted sedan. Behind me, the voices rose in argument, my aunt pleading, my father shouting, my mother excusing, but I kept walking. I slid behind the wheel, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and whispered to myself, "No more. Not one more year." That night marked the end of the daughter I had been trained to be, the obedient provider, the invisible backbone. As I drove away, the weight of decades pressed on me, but under it all was a spark I hadn't felt in years, the possibility of freedom. What I didn't know then was how quickly that decision would unravel everything. By morning, the house I had been bankrolling would plunge into chaos, the police would be called, and every illusion I had clung to about family loyalty would collapse. But in that moment, as the tail lights cut through the snow and the house vanished in my rearview mirror, I only knew this when he disowned me. He unknowingly handed me back my life. When I finally shut the apartment door behind me that night, the silence hit harder than my father's words. My arms still ached from carrying the grocery bags, my chest burned from holding back tears, and my mind was a carousel of memories I didn't want to face. But beneath the pain, a steely clarity began to take shape. If I had been disowned for paying their bills, then what was I still paying for? I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the spreadsheet I hadn't dared to confront before. Row after row listed the obligations I had shouldered: the $800 mortgage that kept the roof over their heads, the $400 in utilities that kept the lights on, the $600 in car payments for vehicles I didn't even drive. Adding them together, I stared at the number I knew too well, $9,600 a year, nearly a tenth of my income disappearing like clockwork. It was more than math. It was proof of my role, not a daughter, but a provider. The fury that had stayed buried at the dinner table began to rise now in the solitude of my room. My father's voice echoed, "Paying bills doesn't make you family." He had stripped away the last illusion I had clung to. And if money didn't make me family, then money no longer needed to tie me down. I took a deep breath and started clicking. First, I logged into the mortgage company's portal. With trembling fingers, I canceled the automatic payment. Next, the utility company, electric, gas, water, each one unlinked from my bank account. Then the car loans. My parents would receive notices within days, but tonight the flow of money stopped here. Every cancellation brought a strange kind of release. My hands shook, my heart raced, but with each click, the invisible chains loosened. By the time I moved on to the smaller items, the insurance, the phone bill, the internet, even the streaming services, they were no longer obligations. They were symbols of a role I had been forced to play, one I was finally discarding. Around midnight, I opened the security system app I had installed for them last year. Cameras, smart locks, thermostats, all connected to my card. For a moment, I hesitated. This was more than money. This was control over the very systems that protected their home. Then I remembered my father's sneer at the dinner table. "We got along fine before she started helping, and we'll get along fine if she stops." Fine. Let them. With one final keystroke, I removed my information. The system went dark. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, but lighter than I had felt in years. For too long, I had believed that support was love, that sacrifice would buy acceptance. Tonight, I saw the truth. I hadn't been a daughter in their eyes for years. I had been an ATM with a smile. Still, a flicker of guilt wormed its way into my chest. What if they really couldn't manage without me? What if I was condemning them to ruin? I almost reopened the mortgage site, almost re-entered my payment details. But then I remembered the look in my father's eyes. Not disappointment, not sadness, but contempt. That was the moment my guilt began to wither. I whispered to myself, they said I'm not family, so tonight I'll stop being their keeper. And here's where I want to pause and ask you, the one listening. Have you ever been told that everything you gave still wasn't enough? If you've ever felt the weight of being used by the people you thought would protect you, you'll understand the crossroads I faced that night. If my story resonates, if you've ever had to choose between loyalty and your own freedom, I invite you to stay with me, to subscribe, to share where you're listening from. Because stories like these aren't just mine. They belong to everyone who's had to reclaim themselves. By 1:30 a.m., every account was shut down, every link severed. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, breathing in the stillness. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't terrified of the next bill arriving in the mail. I wasn't waiting for another emergency call. I wasn't an invisible lifeline tethered to people who would never acknowledge it. I thought of the house I had just left, the one that depended on me to keep it standing, and I knew what dawn would bring. Chaos, panic, accusations. But that was tomorrow's storm. Tonight was mine. Tonight was the moment I stopped being the daughter they could drain and started being the woman who chose her own survival. I crawled into bed, pulled the blanket to my chin, and let the exhaustion wash over me. For once, the silence wasn't empty. It was mine. I didn't arrive at this breaking point overnight. To understand why my father's words cut so deep, you'd have to see the foundation they rested on. My story didn't start at that Thanksgiving table. It began decades earlier in the small house where favoritism was as natural as breathing. From the time I was 7, I knew where I stood. My younger brother Dylan was the golden boy. He got the bigger bedroom with the window view, the latest sneakers when they hit the shelves, the louder cheers at every school event. Me, I was the responsible one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, who kept her grades up without needing attention. Responsibility was supposed to be my reward. But responsibility doesn't hug you goodnight. Responsibility doesn't clap when you walk across the stage. I still remember the first time the truth became undeniable. Dylan had come home with a report card full of C's, a careless grin plastered on his face. Dad rolled his eyes at first, but later that evening I watched from the stairs as a brand new bicycle was wheeled into the living room. "Every boy needs some encouragement," Dad said proudly. Meanwhile, my straight A's earned me nothing more than a pat on the head and the ever-familiar phrase, "Keep it up." That bike might as well have been a crown proof. That effort didn't matter as much as being born the favored one. That pattern carved itself into every corner of our childhood. Birthdays were the worst. Dylan's parties filled the backyard with balloons, rented bounce houses, and piles of gifts from relatives coached by my parents. Mine dinner at the local diner, maybe a modest cake at home. I told myself I didn't mind that it wasn't important, but inside I kept wondering what made me so invisible. The school years were no different. I'd bring home ribbons, certificates, even trophies from science fairs and spelling bees. They'd smile politely, maybe stick the paper on the fridge for a week before replacing it with Dylan's artwork or his team schedule. He was praised for showing up. I was expected to excel and then step quietly aside. It wasn't just material things, it was tone, attention, presence. Dad's booming laugh when Dylan recounted a story that wasn't even funny. Mom's teary pride when he made the basketball team, though he mostly warmed the bench. For me, there was always a correction. Don't brag. Don't be difficult. Don't expect so much. Over time, I learned to swallow my accomplishments before they even left my lips. Looking back now, I can see how those years trained me for the role I would later play. I was conditioned to give more and expect less. To hustle for scraps of affection, to prove my worth through service, instead of being valued simply for existing. My family didn't have to ask me to sacrifice. They had built me for it. And yet as a child, I still hoped. I still believed that if I worked harder, if I was perfect enough, they'd see me. I'd lie awake some nights rehearsing the conversations where Dad would finally say, "I'm proud of you." But morning always came, and with it the reminder that pride had already been spoken for, reserved for my brother. Years later, when people ask me why I stayed so long in the role of provider, why I gave thousands of dollars to parents who never thanked me, I have to be honest, because I was taught to. Because deep down, the little girl in me still wanted the bike, the balloons, the cheer from the stands. That little girl carried her invisible crown into adulthood, hoping one more sacrifice would tip the scales. She didn't understand then what I understand now, that some scales are rigged from the start. And maybe that's why when my father disowned me at Thanksgiving, it didn't just feel like a betrayal of the present. It felt like the final confirmation of a lifetime of imbalance. His words weren't new. They were the echo of every overlooked report card, every quiet birthday, every time Dylan's mediocrity was celebrated louder than my excellence. It hurts to admit this, but here's the truth. I wasn't shocked by what happened at that dinner table. Deep down, I'd been waiting for it my whole life. When I turned 18, life wasted no time reminding me where I stood in my family's hierarchy. My father lost his job at the auto plant where he'd worked for 20 years. The day he came home with the pink slip silence fell across the house like a shroud. My mother, who had only ever worked part-time as a receptionist, couldn't possibly cover the mortgage and bills on her modest paycheck. And just like that, everything shifted. Most families in times of crisis rally together. But in mine, the expectations weren't equal. Dylan was still in high school, free to focus on sports and his endless cycle of new hobbies. I, on the other hand, had just been accepted to college, a dream I had clawed my way toward with late-night study sessions and a resume packed with extracurriculars. That dream suddenly came with a catch. "We don't know how we'll be able to help you." My mother confessed, her tone tinged with resignation, as though my education were the expendable piece of the puzzle. So I did what I had always been conditioned to do. I bore the weight. I took out student loans that felt like shackles even before the ink dried. I signed on for 3 part-time jobs, waiting tables in the morning, shelving books at the campus library in the afternoon, and entering data from my dorm room deep into the night. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My days blurred into a cycle of exhaustion, caffeine, and relentless determination. Meanwhile, Dylan enjoyed what little financial stability my parents could still muster. Somehow, when his turn for college arrived 3 years later, they found a way. They took out a second mortgage, scraped together funds, and presented him with a tuition paid in full. The irony stung like salt. In a wound, I had juggled jobs and debt to earn every credit hour, while he was handed what I had been denied. I can still picture myself walking across campus at dawn, the weight of textbooks digging into my shoulders, my uniform smelling of coffee and grease from the diner's breakfast shift. My hands cracked from dish soap, my eyes heavy from late-night spreadsheets. And yet, despite all the strain, I never complained. Because some naive part of me believed this suffering would mean something. That one day when I graduated, my parents would finally look at me with pride instead of indifference. But pride never came. Dylan's ventures even then were met with applause. He wanted to start a business refurbishing old electronics. My parents boasted about his entrepreneurial spirit. I wanted to survive another semester without collapsing from exhaustion. My efforts were invisible. The hardest part wasn't just the imbalance, it was the isolation. On weekends, I'd come home to find Dylan laughing with Dad in the garage, or Mom beaming at his half-baked plans, while I quietly balanced my checkbook in the corner, calculating whether I could afford both rent and textbooks that month. Nobody asked how I managed. Nobody noticed the dark circles under my eyes. Looking back, I realized those years cemented the pattern that would define my 20s, me as the lifeline, them as the beneficiaries. It started with loans and side jobs, but it grew into something much larger, a role I didn't volunteer for, but couldn't escape. Still, there was one thing those grueling years gave me that favoritism never could: resilience. Every early morning shift, every late-night cram session, every bill I paid with money I earned myself, hardened me into someone who could survive anything. When life said, "You're on your own," I answered, "Then I'll make it work." And make it work I did. 4 years later, I walked across the stage in my cap and gown diploma in hand, carrying not just the weight of my own ambition, but the invisible burden of proving that I could rise without their help. My parents clapped politely, but their cheers once again belonged to Dylan, who was already pitching his next big idea. I smiled anyway, because that day I wasn't just a graduate, I was the architect of my own survival. And though I didn't know it yet, the same resilience that got me through those 4 years would one day give me the courage to walk away from the family that never truly saw me. Graduating with a degree in computer science felt like crawling out of a pit I had been trapped in for years. I had survived the endless shifts, the student loans, the quiet dismissals from my own family. 6 months of relentless job hunting later, I finally landed my first position at a growing tech company in Detroit. It wasn't glamorous at first, but the paycheck was steady, and for the first time I could breathe without calculating whether every dollar would stretch far enough. By 24, I had moved up quickly. Promotions, raises, projects that challenged me instead of draining me. The long nights of data entry in my dorm room had paid off. I was earning a 6-figure salary, something my parents could hardly comprehend. I thought this meant freedom. What I didn't realize was that success in my world meant shackles in theirs. It started innocently enough. Phone calls from my mother, casual at first, catching up on work and life. Then the subtle shift. "The mortgage is late again, honey. We're just short this month." Or, "Your father's car needs repairs just this once. Could you help?" I said yes, of course. I had the means, and guilt twisted inside me every time I thought of them struggling while I had finally made it. But 1 month became 3, 3 became a year, and before long the pattern hardened into an expectation. I wasn't just helping. I was paying their $800 mortgage every month, the $400 utilities, the $600 car payments. Without a word, I had taken over their household finances. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were grateful, even if the words never came. What I didn't tell myself, what I didn't want to admit, was that I had become their safety net at the expense of my own dreams. I lived in a modest apartment with peeling paint and secondhand furniture. I drove the same rusted car from college for nearly 8 years, its passenger door sometimes refusing to open. I put off buying a home of my own, always convincing myself that next year I'd start saving. Yet every spare dollar ended up in an emergency fund jar labeled for them. Meanwhile, my brother Dylan drifted from one business venture to another, each failure swallowed whole by my parents' boundless optimism. When his dropshipping scheme collapsed, Dad told the neighbors how bold he was for trying. When the food truck never even acquired a truck, Mom bragged about his creativity. And when his crypto investments disappeared into thin air, they mourned his bad luck. Not once did they look at me, the daughter funding their survival, and say, "We're proud." Sometimes my best friend Samantha would sit across from me at our weekly wine nights, shaking her head in disbelief. "You realize you're giving them almost 10 grand a year, right? That's nearly $30,000 once you count the extras. What are you getting back?" I'd laugh nervously, swirling the wine in my glass. "Their family. What else am I supposed to do, let them lose the house?" But each time I said it, the words rang hollower, and Sam's eyes told me she saw through the excuse. If you've ever been in that position, caught between duty and dignity, you'll know the ache of it. You'll know what it's like to wake up in the morning and wonder if you're being loyal or just being used. Tell me, have you ever found yourself sacrificing your own future because you couldn't stand the thought of saying no to family? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear if you've been there too, because this is the trap no one warns you about. The cruel irony was that my generosity didn't elevate me in their eyes. It erased me further. I wasn't their daughter who had fought her way through debt and exhaustion to build a career. I was the wallet with legs, the silent partner in their household. And the more I gave, the less visible I became. Looking back, I think that's when the invisible crown from my childhood finally transformed into invisible chains. I had bought into the idea that financial support would buy me the appreciation I craved. Instead, it became the proof that I wasn't valued for who I was, only for what I could provide. That's why when Thanksgiving came around and my father chose to disown me, it wasn't just the end of a holiday gone wrong. It was the culmination of years of being bound by obligations I never should have carried. And though I didn't know it yet, those chains were about to snap. If my role in the family was to quietly shoulder responsibility, then Dylan's was the opposite. He was the dreamer, the risk-taker, the one who could do no wrong, even when his failures stacked higher than his promises. My parents never called them failures, of course. To them, every collapse was just another step toward success. I'll never forget his first big idea after college, an online dropshipping business. He claimed he could import electronics in bulk and sell them for a profit. 6 months later, the site was offline, the inventory unsold, and the debt conveniently written off as startup costs. My father told the neighbors how proud he was of Dylan's entrepreneurial spirit, while I quietly paid another round of bills to keep their lights on. Then came the food truck. At family dinners, Dylan sketched menus on napkins and boasted about taking the city by storm. The problem, he never actually bought a truck. 3 months later, the idea vanished, but not before my parents lent him money they couldn't afford. They beamed at him anyway, as if failure itself was proof of genius. After that was the crypto scheme. He convinced mom and dad to invest nearly $15,000 money I later discovered had been pulled directly from their dwindling retirement account. When the coin collapsed, they called it bad luck. I wanted to scream, bad luck. No, it was negligence. But pointing that out only made me the villain, the sister who never supported his dreams. Meanwhile, I was funding their real survival, $9,600 a year, sometimes more when emergencies popped up. But Dylan's narrative was the one that counted. He was the visionary. I was the boring one with the corporate job. They paraded his ideas at every family gathering, while my actual career, the one paying their mortgage, was mentioned in passing, if at all. What burned most wasn't the money. It was the way they looked at him. Their eyes lit up when he talked, their voices swelled with pride, their hands clapped his back in encouragement. I'd sit across the table, listening invisible, wondering how many more failures he needed before they saw the truth. Sometimes I wondered if Dylan believed his own myth. One night when I confronted him about dragging our parents into another doomed project, he laughed. "At least I take risks, Claire. You hide behind your salary like it's an achievement. Anyone can work a job. Not everyone can change the world. Change the world." He hadn't even changed his mailing address in years, still living at home eating food I indirectly paid for. But his arrogance was buoyed by their constant validation, and that made him untouchable. The imbalance was suffocating. When Dylan called to announce his latest idea, a subscription box for pet toys, my mother gushed as though he'd invented electricity. I asked practical questions. What about logistics, marketing, funding? They dismissed me with sighs, as though logic itself was disloyalty. 3 months later, it collapsed, just like the rest. 2 local investors even threatened legal action. My parents panicked. and of course turned to me. Could you help your brother out of this little situation? Their little situation would have cost me $12,000. This time I said no. The weeks that followed were filled with cold shoulders and guilt-laden phone calls about family loyalty. I could almost script the conversations myself, Mom whispering, "He just needs one big break." Dad insisting family sticks together. Not once did they acknowledge that family had been sticking together because of me all along. If you're listening now, maybe you know someone like Dylan. Someone who fails upward, buoyed by the blind faith of people who refuse to see the wreckage left behind. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched someone get endless praise while you quietly carried the weight they ignored? Because that's where I lived year after year, sacrifice after sacrifice, watching my brother shine under a spotlight I had built, but was never allowed to stand in. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around that year, my patience was threadbare. Dylan's newest revolutionary idea was already brewing, and my parents were hinting, no expecting that I would bankroll it like I had bankrolled everything else. I didn't know then how that dinner would end, but I knew one thing: my silence was starting to splinter. And when it finally cracked, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. For years, I told myself it was enough to give. That maybe if I poured enough money, time, and energy into my family one day, they'd finally see me. But each sacrifice seemed to vanish like smoke. The more I gave, the less it mattered. Take my mother's 60th birthday. I spent weeks planning the perfect surprise, a weekend getaway in Chicago. 2 nights at a luxury hotel, theater tickets to a Broadway tour, reservations at a Michelin-starred restaurant. The bill was over $2,000 more than I had ever spent on myself at once. I wanted it to feel special, unforgettable. When they returned, I waited for excitement, for gratitude. Instead, Mom said flatly, "We had a nice time." Then she launched into a glowing retelling of the birthday card. Dylan had written her 2 paragraphs of flowery words that in her eyes eclipsed everything I had done. Or the time my father needed gallbladder surgery. I took 2 weeks of unpaid leave money I couldn't spare to care for him at home. I cooked his meals, cleaned the house, drove him to every follow-up appointment. I organized his medications into a schedule, thinking I was making his recovery easier. By the end, his only comment was a complaint. "You rearranged the pill organizer wrong. Dylan would have done it better." Dylan, who was at a poker table while I was scrubbing dishes and disinfecting countertops. The more I recall, the more examples flood back. Dylan would call once a month, spin another dream, and my parents' eyes would shine with pride. I could drain my savings to keep the heat on, but the moment he walked into the room, I disappeared. They celebrated his failures like triumphs, while my real triumphs, my promotions, my stability, the literal roof over their heads, were brushed aside. The breaking point for me came with Dylan's pet toy subscription box. After 3 months, it collapsed spectacularly, leaving 2 investors furious and threatening lawsuits. My parents called me in a panic, voices quivering, not because they feared for Dylan's reputation, but because they thought I could bail him out. "It's just $12,000, Mom said, as if that number were pocket change. When I refused, silence filled the line. Then came the guilt trips. Family helps family. He just needs this one chance. I remember sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding. For once, I said no and held the line. But even then, I knew what it meant: weeks of icy conversations, of being treated like the traitor who had abandoned her brother. Here's the truth: giving never bought me their love. It only set the bar higher, an endless climb toward a summit that didn't exist. They didn't see my sacrifices as love, they saw them as obligations. My rewards weren't gratitude or affection, they were comparisons: Dylan's card, Dylan's dreams, Dylan's imagined brilliance. Sometimes late at night, my best friend Samantha would shake her head and say, "You've become their ATM, that's all they see." I hated how right she was. Still, I kept hoping for a shift, for one moment when they'd look at me and say, "We couldn't have done this without you." But that moment never came. If you've ever poured yourself into someone only to watch them hand their admiration to someone else, you know that sting. Let me ask you, have you ever given everything only to be told it wasn't enough? It's a hollow pain, one that echoes louder each time you're dismissed. By the time that Thanksgiving approached, I was already raw from years of being overlooked. My savings had withered, my own dreams postponed, all in service of keeping them afloat. And yet the one truth I couldn't escape was this: no matter what I gave, Dylan's shadow always fell over me. That's why when I walked into my parents' house, carrying armfuls of groceries ready to cook a feast, I had planned down to the last detail. I was clinging to the tiniest ember of hope. Hope that maybe just this once they'd notice. That maybe after 8 years of sacrifices, buried under indifference, my efforts would shine brighter than Dylan's charm. I was wrong, and the night would prove it in ways I never imagined. Thanksgiving that year was supposed to be my chance at redemption. After years of shouldering their bills, ignoring their dismissals, and being overshadowed by Dylan's endless failures, I thought if I created the perfect holiday, maybe, just maybe, they would finally see me. I poured nearly $400 into the preparations: an organic turkey, so plump it barely fit in my cart; artisanal bread, for stuffing; premium wines recommended by a sommelier; 3 different kinds of pies. I even bought a new autumn-themed table runner and borrowed extra chairs from a neighbor. Samantha, my closest friend, pushed the grocery cart beside me, her eyebrows raised. "Are you sure they'll appreciate all this?" she asked gently. I forced a smile. "This year will be different. I've got the bonus. We have plenty to celebrate." 3 days before the big day, my mother called with what she framed as a suggestion, but felt like a command. "We think it's better to have dinner at our place. Your father prefers the tradition, and Aunt Susan wants to see the house again." I glanced at my refrigerator, packed with food, my counters covered in prep work, but I swallowed my frustration. "Fine, I'll bring everything over." On Thanksgiving morning, gray skies and light snow framed the drive to my parents' house. My car groaned under the weight of carefully packed dishes and bottles of wine. When I knocked, arms straining with bags, my father opened the door and frowned. "You're blocking the driveway. Dylan will need to park there. Not a hello, not a thank you, just a complaint." I brushed past him, setting the groceries on the counter. Mom emerged from the kitchen, her eyes narrowing at my burgundy sweater dress. "Well, look at you all dressed up. Some of us have been cooking since 6 this morning." I held up the turkey. "I brought everything prepped and ready. The oven's all yours," she smirked. "I already started my stuffing. You know how your father only likes my recipe." For hours I cooked alone while they watched football. Every dish was timed with military precision: mashed potatoes, whipped smooth vegetables, roasted to a golden crisp, pies cooling on the counter. At 1:30 the doorbell rang, and cheers erupted as Dylan walked in empty-handed. Dad boomed. The man of the hour. He received hugs and laughter as though he had brought the feast himself. He winked at me. "Something smells good, sis. You always were the kitchen wizard." I clenched my jaw and returned to the stove. Minutes later, more relatives arrived carrying soda bottles and a store-bought pumpkin pie. My mother cooed over their contribution as though it were the crown jewel of the meal. When Aunt Susan slipped into the kitchen and offered to help, I nearly cried with relief. For the first time that day, someone noticed the weight I was carrying. By 3 p.m., the table gleamed with china, the turkey roasted to perfection, every side dish steaming hot. It should have been a triumph. But as Dad carved the bird, Mom frowned. "Looks a little dry." I usually cover mine with more butter. Dad sipped the wine I had splurged on. "Too sweet." Dylan smirked, downing his glass. "Free booze is the best booze." When Dad led grace, his voice boomed. "Lord, we thank you for bringing Dylan home safely. For this house. For family." Not a single word about the daughter who had funded both the house and the feast. As the prayer ended, the seating arrangement told its own story. Dylan between Mom and Dad. At the head of the table, me pushed to the far end, as distant physically as I had always been emotionally. If you've ever tried to buy love to craft perfection, hoping for validation that never comes, you know what I felt as I quietly filled plates. The food I had poured my bonus into became background noise to Dylan's endless chatter. My mother beamed at him, my father nodded proudly, and I sat there invisible once again. But something inside me shifted that day. For years I had swallowed the sting, told myself gratitude would come tomorrow, next year, someday. But as I watched them laugh and cheer over a son who had contributed nothing, while I sat surrounded by the very evidence of my sacrifice, I realized someday wasn't coming. Thanksgiving was supposed to bring families together. Instead, it was about to tear mine apart for good. The first crack in my composure came with dessert. The turkey had been sliced, the stuffing scooped, the plates cleared. I set the pumpkin pie on the table, the crust golden, the filling still warm. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment they noticed me. Instead, Dylan cleared his throat, grinned, and announced, "So I've got a new business venture." My fork hovered midair. Here we go again. He launched into a speech about a fitness app he was developing, his hands slicing through the air like a motivational speaker. "This will revolutionize how people work out from home. All I need is $40,000 to build the prototype and get the marketing rolling." I glanced at my parents. Their eyes sparkled as though he had already built the next Apple. "We might be able to help," Mom said, nodding toward Dad. Dad puffed his chest. "Family has to support each other's dreams." My heart nearly stopped. Support. Their support meant draining the little retirement savings they had left, money I already knew couldn't cover their future. And who would be expected to pick up the slack when it vanished? Me, always me. I set down my fork and forced my voice to stay calm. "Dylan, have you done any research? The fitness app market is already saturated. 90% of startups fail in the first year." He rolled his eyes. "You wouldn't understand. You hide behind your corporate job." Mom sighed theatrically, turning to the table. There she goes again, raining on his parade. The words ignited something inside me. For years I had stayed silent, swallowing the bitterness. But not tonight. Raining on his parade, I'm the one who's kept this family afloat for 8 years. The mortgage, the utilities, the cars, $9,600 every single year. The room froze. Forks stilled. Glasses clinked down against the table. Aunt Susan shifted uncomfortably in her chair. My cousin stared at his plate. Dad's voice dropped low, dangerous. "We don't discuss family finances at the table." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Then maybe we should, because if you throw your savings into this, you won't have a retirement. And you know who you'll expect to cover the difference." Dylan's face flushed crimson. "You're just jealous. You always have been." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Jealous of debt collapse and fantasy schemes. But before I could answer, Dad slammed his hand on the table, plates rattling. "Get out. Paying bills doesn't make you family. You think your money makes you better than us? No one asked you to pay our bills." The words hit harder than any blow. My breath caught. Across the table, Mom leaned in, whispering just loud enough for all to hear, "You've always been jealous of your brother." And just like that, the dam inside me broke. I placed my napkin down my hands, surprisingly calm, despite the storm raging in my chest. "Then let him pay the $9,600. Silence fell like a stone. Dylan's smirk faltered. Dad's jaw clenched, Mom's lips pressed tight. But I didn't wait for their response. I stood, grabbed my purse, and walked out. Each step away from that table felt like a step out of prison. If you've ever reached the breaking point, if you've ever realized that silence no longer protects you, but destroys you, you'll understand why I walked. And here's the truth. What happened after I left made everything that night look small. What came next was chaos, the kind I never imagined, police accusations, manipulation so brazen, it stunned even me. But that's a story you'll want to hear to the very end. Stay with me, don't go anywhere. Because what happened the morning after Thanksgiving changed everything, and you'll want to know exactly how far they went once I cut them off. When I think back to that Thanksgiving table, it wasn't the food or the decorations. I remember it was the sound of my father's hand slamming down against the wood, rattling plates and silverware. The turkey knives quivered. The laughter died. His face flushed red, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Get out. Paying bills doesn't make you family." For a moment, no one moved. My breath hitched, the words echoing inside me, louder than the slam of his hand. 8 years of sacrifice, mortgage, utilities, car payments, all dismissed in a single outburst. I searched his eyes for some glimmer of regret, but all I saw was contempt, sharpened by years of unspoken resentment. Mom leaned in then, as if to soften the blow, but her whisper was just as sharp. "You've always been jealous of your brother." It was surreal. There I stood, the daughter who had written check after check, canceled trips, postponed dreams, all so they could keep their house, their cars, their sense of stability. And instead of thanks, I was painted as jealous, bitter, selfish. I felt something snap inside me, not out of rage, but clarity. I placed my napkin gently on the table, as though I were setting down the last piece of evidence in a trial. Then let him pay the $9,600, I said evenly. My voice didn't shake. My father's glare deepened. Dylan's smirk vanished, and the relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Dad wasn't finished. His voice rose again thick with venom. You were always difficult. Never grateful, always questioning. You think your fancy job makes you better than us? Family is about loyalty, not dollar signs. Dylan understands that. You never have. The irony nearly stole my breath. Loyalty, I had been loyal every single month for nearly a decade. I had been loyal while they bragged about Dylan's failures as though they were triumphs. I had been loyal while my own milestones, graduations, promotions, bonuses were brushed aside. Loyalty had drained me of nearly $240,000 across 8 years' money that could have built my own future. And yet in his eyes, it meant nothing. Aunt Susan tried to intervene, her voice trembling. Richard, that's not fair. But he cut her off with a wave of his hand, dismissing her like he dismissed me. The only sound after that was the scrape of my chair against the floor as I stood. I picked up my purse and my car keys. The room blurred with heat and humiliation, but my movements were steady. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of tears. Behind me, I heard my father's final blow. Don't bother coming back for Christmas. I paused at the hallway, his words settling over me like ash. For a heartbeat, the child in me, the one who still longed for their love, begged me to turn back, to apologize, to fight. But the woman I had become knew better. He meant every word. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment explosion. This was the truth, finally spoken out loud. As I slipped on my coat, my cousin Natalie hurried after me, her eyes wide. Are you okay to drive? That was intense. I nodded, forcing a tight smile. I'm fine. Thank you, she whispered. We all know how much you do for them. What they said, it wasn't right. Her words, soft and genuine, were the only comfort I carried with me out the door. The cold night air hit my face like a second slap. My father's voice still rang in my ears. My mother's whisper twisted around my ribs. Dylan's smugness still heavy in the room I had left behind. But with every step toward my car, I felt lighter, freer, as if each footfall shed another chain I hadn't realized was still binding me. I didn't look back when I slid into the driver's seat. The house loomed in my rearview mirror, lit up and warm, but it was no longer mine. I had paid for it in dollars, in years, in pieces of myself. And now, in one explosive dinner, I was locked out of it forever. And strangely, that thought didn't terrify me. It felt like the beginning of something else, something raw, painful, but necessary. Because when the people you've given everything to tell you you're not family, the only choice left is to become your own. Walking out of that dining room felt like walking off a battlefield. My father's rage still echoed in my chest. My mother's whisper still stung like salt in an open wound. But for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their burdens on my back, I was carrying my own decision. I stopped at the doorway long enough to look back at the table. My brother Dylan sat between my parents, basking in the glow of a loyalty he had never earned. My father refilled his wine, his hand still trembling from the outburst. My mother fussed over Dylan's plate, ignoring the tension choking the room. They looked comfortable in their narrative, the same one they had clung to my whole life, Dylan, the favored son. Me, the jealous daughter. But I wasn't jealous. I was done. I slipped on my coat, turned the knob, and let the cold air rush in. My aunt's voice broke through behind me. Claire, don't go. It's just words, they don't mean it. But I knew better. Words like those don't erupt out of nowhere. They simmer for years until they finally find their way out. My father had been holding them in since I was a child. He just chose Thanksgiving dinner to finally set them free. As I stepped into the night, the last thing I heard was his voice, sharp and final. Don't bother coming back for Christmas. I paused at the car, my keys digging into my palm. For a flicker of a moment, the obedient daughter inside me, the one who had paid their bills, fixed their crises, postponed her own dreams, wanted to turn back to beg for forgiveness, to promise I'd do better. But then I remembered his words. Paying bills doesn't make you family. And I realized something crucial. If all those years of sacrifice hadn't bought me a place at that table, nothing ever would. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. My hands trembled not from fear, but from release. 8 years of servitude had ended in one explosive evening, and as painful as it was, I felt something new rising in its place resolve. That's when the thought crystallized. If they can disown me in front of a table full of relatives, then I can disown them in the privacy of my own heart. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't anger, it was survival. I pulled out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the snow, and whispered aloud, "Then let him pay the $9,600. The words tasted sharp, but they also tasted like freedom. The drive home was a blur, tears streaking down my face, my chest tight with grief. Yet beneath the grief was something stronger, a quiet certainty that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. For too long I had been their safety net, their silent provider, the shadow they leaned on without acknowledgement. That night I cut the net. When I reached my apartment, the silence felt different. Not oppressive this time, but cleansing. I sat at my desk, staring at the stack of unpaid bills, none of them mine, and realized I had a choice. For years I had believed I was powerless, trapped by obligation. But the truth was sitting right there in front of me. Every account, every payment, every transfer was in my name. I didn't have to keep feeding a system that dismissed me. That was the moment I decided. If they no longer considered me family, then I would no longer play the role of caretaker. Tomorrow the dismantling would begin. And maybe that's the real lesson I want you to hear. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to step away, to sever the ties that are strangling you, even if those ties carry the name family. Because blood may define relation, but it does not define love. That night, as I crawled into bed, I felt the strange calm of someone who had burned the bridge behind her, not recklessly, but necessarily. And though I didn't yet know what chaos awaited me in the morning, I knew this much: the cycle was broken. When I shut the door to my apartment that night, the silence pressed in on me like a weight. But it wasn't the suffocating silence I'd known for years, the kind that came with waiting for the next phone call about an overdue bill or a family emergency. This silence was different. It was heavy, yes, but it was mine. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the numbers. For so long I had avoided looking at the full picture. I kept vague track mortgage, utilities, car payments, but never added it all together. Now, with my father's voice still ringing in my ears, paying bills doesn't make you family, I decided it was time to face the truth. Line by line, I entered the figures. Mortgage $800 a month. Utilities $400 a month. Car payments $600 a month. Insurance, phone bills, internet streaming services, another few hundred. Emergency extras, doctor visits, car repairs, Dylan's failed business scraps, at least $200 a month. When I totaled it, my breath caught. Nearly $2,500 every month. $30,000 a year. Over 8 years, close to $250,000. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the number as if it might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. $240,000. Money that could have been a down payment on a home. Money that could have gone into retirement savings, into travel, into a future of my own. Instead, it had been funneled into a black hole of ungratefulness. And what had I gotten in return? Dismissals, comparisons, accusations of jealousy. For the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't generosity anymore. It was exploitation. I clicked over to the mortgage company's site. My finger hovered over the cancel autopay button. My stomach twisted, my heart raced, but I pressed it. Done. Next was the utility portal. Cancel. Then the car loans. Cancel. One by one, I unlinked my accounts, severing the ties that had bound me to their household. Each click felt like cutting a thread in a web I hadn't realized was strangling me. The smaller things came next. Streaming services, passwords changed, internet payment method removed, family phone plan canceled. Even the smart home security system I had installed last year gone. Their lights, thermostats, and cameras went dark in seconds. For a moment I hesitated. Was this too cruel? What if they woke up to chaos? What if they couldn't handle it? Then my father's words replayed. We got along fine before she started helping, and we'll get along fine if she stops. Fine, let's see. I sent polite emails to each company notifying them that billing responsibility would revert to Richard and Eleanor Morris, effective immediately. No dramatics, no apologies, just business. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had dismantled the entire structure I had built for them. It wasn't revenge, it was liberation. For years, I had convinced myself that my financial sacrifice would eventually buy me the love I longed for. But love doesn't come with invoices. If they couldn't see my worth without dollar signs attached, they were never going to see it at all. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, my breathing ragged, my body trembling with adrenaline. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff after leaping terrifying, exhilarating, irreversible. And here's the part I want you to hear, the part that kept me awake long after midnight. Have you ever realized in one blinding moment that you've been living someone else's story, not your own? That was me staring at canceled payments and broken chains. For the first time in years, I wasn't just their daughter, their provider, their scapegoat. I was a woman who had chosen herself. I slipped into bed, pulling the blanket over my shoulders. My phone buzzed once, then again, but I ignored it. Tomorrow would bring panic, anger, accusations, I knew that. But tonight, in this fragile silence, I finally belonged to myself. And what came next? Let's just say the storm that rolled in by morning made Thanksgiving dinner look like a drizzle. Morning arrived not with peace, but with a storm I could never have predicted. My phone lit up like a slot machine, buzz after buzz, call after call, notifications stacking so fast I couldn't clear them. 37 missed calls, 52 text messages, dozens of voicemails. The first one I played was from my aunt, her voice shaky. "Claire, it's Aunt Susan. Call me the second you get this. There's a situation at your parents' house. They woke up to find everything shut down, the lights, the heat, even the alarm system. Your dad called the police. He thinks someone hacked them. Please just call me." I sat frozen, the phone pressed to my ear. They thought it was a hack. In a way, it was only I was the hacker, and the target wasn't their home. It was the illusion of my obligation. The next voicemail came from Dylan. His voice dripped with entitlement. "What the hell did you do? The car just got repossessed. I had an important meeting and now I'm stranded. Fix this, Claire. Now." Then came my mother's escalating messages. "At 7:30 a.m., you call us right now and explain what's going on with our accounts. At 8:15, the mortgage company just called. Did you cancel the payment? Is this some kind of sick joke?" At 8:45, her voice broke into theatrics. "Your father is having chest pains from the stress. If anything happens to him, it'll be on your conscience. And by 9 suffer. Please, sweetheart, if we said anything wrong last night, we're sorry. Just fix this. We can't handle all this at once." I almost laughed at the whiplash from fury to guilt-tripping to begging, all in less than 2 hours. But the darkest message came from my father at 8:30. His voice was icy, each word measured. "Whatever stunt you're pulling, it ends now. I've spoken to Gary, he's a lawyer. He says what you're doing could be considered elder financial abuse. You have until noon to restore everything, or we'll take legal action." My chest tightened, but not from fear, from recognition. This was their language, threats, guilt, manipulation. Not once did they say thank you. Not once did they acknowledge the 8 years I had kept them afloat. It was as if my entire history with them had been erased the second I stopped paying. Mixed among the chaos were 2 messages that pierced the fog. One from my cousin Natalie. "Hey, just checking on you. Things are insane here, but I understand why you did what you did. They weren't fair to you last night or ever. Take care of yourself." And one from Uncle George, who rarely inserted himself into family drama. "Claire, I just want to say this. While your decision has caused an uproar, your father and mother were wrong last night. We had no idea it was you keeping them afloat all these years. They told us Dylan was helping. We're stunned. Take the time you need. Not everyone thinks you're the villain here." Those words were the lifeline I didn't know I needed. For years I thought I was alone in seeing the imbalance, the favoritism, the injustice. But hearing even one person validate my reality, it cracked the armor of isolation they had built around me. Still, as I scrolled through the barrage of texts, one truth crystallized: I had broken the system. Without my quiet funding, their world was collapsing. The mortgage company sent warnings. The utilities threatened disconnection. Dylan, furious, demanded I fix what I broke. But I hadn't broken anything. I had simply stepped away, and the structure they'd leaned on crumbled under its own weight. And here's where I want you to lean in and really think. Have you ever noticed how when you finally say no, people who depended on your yes will call you selfish, cruel, even abusive? That's not because you did something wrong. It's because you stopped playing the role that benefited them. By noon, my inbox was a battlefield. Anger, threats, pleas. But instead of drowning me, each message made me stronger. The storm outside their house was proof of what I had always known. Deep down, I was the backbone of their lives, and if they wanted me gone, then they would learn to stand without me. Still, I couldn't shake the thought if this was the chaos on the first morning, what would happen in the days ahead. By the end of that chaotic week, the dust began to settle, but not in the way my parents had hoped. Their furious voicemails tapered into cold silence, broken only by the occasional guilt-soaked email. The first days had been pure hysteria, police in their living room utilities threatening to cut service, Dylan screaming that I'd ruined everything. But when it became clear I wasn't restoring a single account, reality finally hit them. And in that silence, I found clarity. That Sunday, I drafted one final message to my parents. It wasn't emotional, it was clinical, almost like a business memo. I wrote, "You made it clear at Thanksgiving that you don't see my contributions as family commitment. I've respected your words by removing myself from your financial affairs. All accounts are now in your responsibility. Please direct any future communication to the service providers directly." I copied my aunt and uncle on the email, not for drama, but for truth. If my parents wanted to paint me as the villain, at least the extended family would see the facts. After hitting send, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: relief. My shoulders loosened, my jaw unclenched. For so long I had been living in reaction, waiting for their calls, bracing for the next emergency. Now, for the first time, I was living on my own terms. But freedom is complicated. Alongside the relief came grief. Grief for the childhood I never had, for the validation I would never receive, for the illusion of parents who could have loved me differently. That grief sent me searching for help, and I found it in therapy. My counselor specialized in family trauma, and with every session I began to untangle years of conditioning, the need to please, the belief that love must be earned, the fear of rejection that kept me chained. I also joined a support group for adult children of emotionally abusive parents. Sitting in a circle with strangers hearing their stories was like looking into mirrors I didn't know existed. Every time someone described being the scapegoat, the invisible child, the provider, no one thanked, I felt less alone. Slowly I rebuilt myself. I began journaling every morning, pouring onto paper the feelings I had buried for years. I practiced meditation, learning to sit with my anxiety instead of drowning in it. I even took up rock climbing, a hobby that terrified me at first, but soon became symbolic, scaling walls, gripping stone, finding strength in my own body when I thought I couldn't hold on. Financially, the shift was staggering. The nearly $2,500 a month that had once vanished into their household now flowed into my savings account. Within 6 months, I had built an emergency fund that was mine and mine alone. I began laying the groundwork for a small web development consultancy, a passion project I had always postponed. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building. And my family? They adapted, though, not gracefully. Word filtered back to me through Aunt Susan. They had sold the house I once paid for and moved into a rental. Dad picked up part-time work as a security guard. Mom increased her hours at the dental office. Dylan. His fitness app never materialized. Without my parents' money, or mine to prop him up, he ended up working retail at a sporting goods store. According to my cousin, he complained constantly that I had destroyed the family. But I had stopped listening. His words no longer had power over me. Neither did theirs. 'Cause here's the thing, sometimes the hardest chains to break aren't financial, they're emotional. And once those chains snapped, I could finally see my worth clearly. If you've ever had to step back from family for your own survival, you'll know that strange mix of sorrow and liberation. It hurts, yes, but it also heals. And in the cracks where the hurt used to live, something stronger grows. And yet, even as I pieced my life back together, I couldn't shake the question, would they ever acknowledge the truth? Or would they spend the rest of their lives rewriting the story with me as the villain? That uncertainty lingered, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going back. Not to the role of provider, not to the shadow of Dylan's spotlight, not to the daughter they never saw. For the first time in my life, I was free. A year after that Thanksgiving night, I found myself standing in the lobby of a hotel in Chicago, the very same one where I had once sent my parents for my mother's birthday. Only this time I wasn't paying for their luxury. I was there for me. I checked into the suite with my own card, unpacked my own bags, and opened the curtains to a view of the skyline I had only glimpsed in passing before. For the first time in my adult life, I was enjoying the fruits of my labor, without guilt, without the shadow of obligation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had once drained myself to give them this exact experience, hoping for love in return. Now I was giving it to myself, and the love was already here. The months leading up to that trip had been transformative. My savings account swelled where it had once bled dry. I moved into a new apartment in a secure building, one my family didn't know the address of. I launched my own side business, a web development consultancy, that grew steadily each weekend. The money that used to vanish into their bills was now investing in my future. But the most profound changes weren't financial. They were emotional. Therapy had peeled back years of conditioning, helping me see that love given out of obligation isn't love at all, it's control. My support group had shown me I wasn't alone, that others had walked this path of cutting ties to survive. And in friendships, true reciprocal friendships, I rediscovered what it felt like to be valued simply for who I am. Even family in unexpected places revealed itself anew. Aunt Susan and Uncle George became more like parents than my own ever were, checking in, inviting me to dinner, celebrating my wins without asking for anything in return. My cousin Natalie sent me texts that never pressured me, just small notes of kindness, thinking of you, proud of you. Even my mother's sister, Aunt Diane, reached out one night and confessed she had always seen the imbalance. "I tried to tell your mom years ago," she said softly. "She wouldn't hear it. But I want you to know some of us always saw your worth." And then there was Michael, a kind, steady architect I met through a friend. On our third date, I finally told him about my estrangement, my fear that it would make me look broken. He reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said words I'll never forget. "Family isn't who you're born to, it's who treats you like you matter." That night, something inside me healed. Do my parents still see me as the villain? Probably. Do they still tell themselves Dylan was the savior while I was the selfish one? Almost certainly. But here's what I've learned. Their version of the story doesn't have to be mine. Looking back on that Thanksgiving, I realized my father did me an unintended favor when he slammed his hand on the table and told me to leave. He thought he was cutting me off. In reality, he was setting me free. Free from a cycle of giving without gratitude. Free from a role I never chose. Free from chasing love that was never going to be given. And if you've listened to me this far, maybe you've lived some of this too. Maybe you know what it feels like to carry a family on your back only to be told it isn't enough. If so, hear me when I say this. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to define family by love, not obligation. So here's my question to you. Have you ever had to cut ties to save yourself? If this story resonates, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button, share it, and keep listening. Because the next story I'll tell you is one you don't want to miss. As I stood by the hotel window, the city lights twinkling like a promise, I whispered to myself, I am no longer their ATM. I am no longer the jealous daughter in Dylan's shadow. I am simply Claire, and I am free. As I close this chapter, I think back to the girl I once was, the one who stayed awake at night calculating bills that weren't hers, praying her sacrifices might one day earn a sliver of love. She believed loyalty meant silence, that devotion meant giving until there was nothing left. I grieve for her because she deserved more. But I'm also proud of her, proud that she found the strength to walk away when the cost became too high, proud that she realized love without respect is just control in disguise, proud that she chose herself not because it was easy, but because it was the only path to freedom. Life after cutting ties hasn't been simple. There are moments I miss the idea of family, the picture I once clung to so tightly. Yet each time the ache rises, I remind myself I did not lose parents that day. I lost the illusion of parents who never truly existed for me. And in their place, I gained something far greater: peace. I've built a circle of people who value me for me, friends, who check in without expecting anything in return, relatives who finally see the truth, and a partner who reminds me daily that family is chosen, not owed. And if you're listening, wondering if you'll ever find the courage to set your own boundaries, I want you to hear this clearly. You already have the strength inside you. You don't need permission to reclaim your life. You don't need validation to walk away from what diminishes you. Sometimes the hardest decision we make is the one that saves us. For me, it was walking out of that house on Thanksgiving night. For you, it may look different. but the lesson is the same: you are allowed to be free. And that freedom, it's worth everything.